If you're having a good time listening to Bradbury 100, please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101. And don't forget to visit my website at bradburymedia.co.uk. This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the life and works of American writer Ray Bradbury. Hello again, and welcome to another in my Chronological Bradbury series, where I'm discussing Ray Bradbury's stories in the order they were originally published. So far, I've covered the years 1938 to 1943, so today, inevitably, I'll be moving on to 1944. Now, just one little piece of housekeeping here before I go any further. I want to re-emphasise that what I'm doing here is working through the stories in order of publication, which means that we get to experience Ray's career as readers of the time would have experienced it. One of the things that makes this interesting, to me, hopefully to you as well, is that it's very different from how readers experience Ray's writing career now. Now we pick up a Bradbury collection and we see it as some kind of statement of where Ray was in the year that that collection was put together. And there's some validity to that. When he put together, say, Long After Midnight, he would have been in some particular frame of mind, which would have influenced which stories he chose for the collection, which order he chose to place them in, and so on. But that can also be misleading, because the reader is likely to assume that Ray actually wrote the stories in that year, whereas the reality is that most of his collections are a real mix of old stuff that he hadn't collected in a book before, and new stuff which he'd only just written. Going by order of publication takes away that focus by collection and returns us to how his career would have looked as it went along. But even that has a big drawback. If we look at things entirely by publication order, we might tend to assume that that is also the composition order. What? You mean it isn't? Yes, I do mean that. Don't forget, Ray was writing constantly. A typical day, according to his own account, might consist of starting a new story and doing some editing or revisions of previously started stories, and sending out finished stories. A story he sent out to a magazine today might have been started yesterday, or last week, or last month, or even last year. And once the stories were out there, they would circulate among the magazines. If magazine A rejected a story, he would send it on to magazine B and then C, and so on. Some stories would be picked up and published straight away. Others could take a year or more to be picked up, and several more months to get into print. Let me give you a couple of extreme examples, using two of the stories published in 1944. There's The Lake, which is one of Ray's best-loved short stories, and it's believed to have been written between December 1942 and October 1943, but it wasn't published until May 1944. And Lazarus Come Forth was finished in November 1943, but not published until nearly a year later, at the end of 1944. So even the publication order could be very different to the order in which the stories were written. Then that leads to a big question: why not discuss the stories in composition order? Well, I'd love to do that, but it goes way beyond what I can achieve in a podcast. My good friend John Eller, in putting together the text for the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury volumes, has published his reconstruction of the composition order as far as it's possible to determine, but only up until about 1945. John probably knows the order after this, but he hasn't discussed it in print. So mere mortals, like me, only have access to the composition order for stories written between about 1938 and 1945. You see, to determine the compositional order requires access to things like original manuscripts, letters between authors and editors, or detailed diaries kept by the author or the editor, or both. In short, working out the order of composition is a major research effort, and it's not something I can do for my humble little podcast. But what I can do, and what I think is very illuminating, is work through the publication order, and hence this series of Chronological Bradbury. So, let's get on with 1944. In this year, there are a colossal 19 stories to cover. That's a 73% increase on the previous year. Ray's productivity was through the roof. To make things manageable, I'm going to have to split those 19 stories over 3 episodes of the podcast. The Seashell. First published in Weird Tales in January 1944. This story can be found today in Bradbury Stories, 100 of his most celebrated tales, and in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 2. It's never appeared in any of Ray's main short story collections. So we're back to Weird Tales, and this in total is Ray's 6th appearance in Weird Tales, and it's also the first of 6 appearances he will make in 1944. He had 1 story in each issue of the magazine for this year. Amazing. Ray had become a Weird Tales fixture. Now, according to John Eller's detailed historical researches documented in Collected Stories Volume 2, Ray completed The Seashell in April 1943 and sold it to Weird Tales in November, and it was published in the January 1944 issue. Ray was apparently paid around $30 for the story, and according to my calculations, that's about $550 in today's money. Ray's agent at the time, Julie Schwartz, initially sent the story to John W. Campbell, as well as being the editor of Astounding, the science fiction magazine. He was also the editor of the fantasy title Unknown Worlds. And this was a fantasy story. But Campbell passed on the story, and Schwartz next sent it to Weird Tales. This shows that Ray wasn't getting automatic acceptances for his stories at this point, if indeed he ever did get automatic acceptances. The Seashell is a very simple story. An 11-year-old boy, Johnny, is confined to bed because he is sick. 2 more days, says the doctor, but Johnny is impatient and he wants to get out into the summer sunshine and play with his friends. Johnny's mother is amused by his impatience and reflects on the philosophy of children, that they must have everything right now, and then tomorrow they'll be desperate for something else which they must have right now. To keep him occupied, she gives him a seashell, and Johnny is amazed when she instructs him to put the shell to his ear, and he hears, of course, the sea. We've all done this. Later, Johnny listens again, and he's amazed to hear not just the sea this time, but voices calling him down to the sea. And these voices are speaking in rhyme. Do you want to come down to the sea, my lad? Do you want to come down to the sea? Well, take me by the hands, my lad. Just take me by the hand, my lad, and come along with me. I assumed that this was some existing poem that Ray was quoting from, or maybe it's some kind of sea shanty. But no amount of Googling has turned up any source for these lines other than this story, so I assume this is a lyric that Ray has composed himself. It has echoes of John Masefield's Sea Fever. That's the one that begins, "I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky." But I can't track anything else that bears a close resemblance to what Ray has given us in this story. If anyone out there is familiar with "Take me by the hands, my lad, take me by the hand," if that's familiar as an existing poem, do let me know. But as far as I know at the moment, Ray wrote those lines himself. So, what makes this a weird tale? Well, it's the ending. Stand by for a spoiler. The next morning, Mum goes into Johnny's room, and he's not there. She assumes he's disobeyed orders, he's left the house to go and play with his friends. But when she picks up the seashell and puts it to her ear, she hears the sea, and she hears Johnny's voice calling out. Johnny has somehow left this world and crossed over into the fantasy sea world that called to him. It's not a bad little story, not particularly outstanding, but there's not really much wrong with it. Some of the ideas in the story are things that Ray would return to again later. The idea that children live at a different pace to adults is something that Ray returns to in Dandelion Wine and its sequel, Farewell Summer. And the setup of the story, this sick child confined to bed, is similar to the 1947 story, The Emissary. Next is Reunion, and this was published in Weird Tales in March 1944. You can find it in Dark Carnival, except for the original UK edition, which omitted it, and you can find it in Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 2. Now, I read this story recently, possibly for the first time. Now, going in, I didn't recognise it, and having completed it, I really felt that this was a story I hadn't seen before. And you know what? I think it may be a new favourite. It's about an 11-year-old orphan called Mal, who lives with his only remaining relatives. There's a mean-spirited Aunt Opie and Uncle Walter, who's a total invalid. Every Monday, we learn, is wash day, and Mal is required to play his part by basically doing whatever Aunt Opie demands of him. The noises of the washing machine symbolise for him the repetitive grind of this existence, and he decides to escape by going up into the attic. Now, as with any Bradbury attic, this is a place of memories. Here Mal finds old photos of his parents and grandparents long dead, old clothes belonging to them, old clothes of his and of his deceased brother David. He finds trunks full of the stuff left over after someone's died. And Mal gets to wondering where his parents are now. Well, in the afterlife maybe, but certainly no longer of this world. And he wonders what they would think of the boy he has become and of the life he is forced to lead. Then, deep in one of the trunks, he finds old clothing which still smells like his parents. Although he doesn't have any clear memories of them, he finds that smells are more evocative than almost any other triggers of his senses. And he stays up there for days, and Aunt Opie thinks he must have run away. While up in the attic, he begins gathering together all the symbols of his family's existence, and he almost wills them back to life. And this being a Weird Tales story, you begin to think that this might be literally what he is about to do. Maybe he's going to resurrect them somehow. But then he takes his own clothes and buries them deep in amongst his parents' and dead brother's clothes. So, maybe he's not going to bring them back to life. Maybe he is thinking of joining them in death. But then his fantasy is destroyed when Aunt Opie finally comes up into the attic and finds him. And here the story takes a little twist, because Aunt Opie makes a fateful decision. Spring cleaning! So Mal is forced to join Aunt Opie in clearing out the entire attic. The old photos are sold, just for their frames. And as for the old clothes, they all go into the wash, and any last trace of his family is destroyed by the pounding mechanism of the washing machine. It's a funny little story, this one, but what I like about it is that it has a bit of everything that we associate with Bradbury. There's nostalgia for wash day as it used to be. The story begins really like a dandelion wine story. There's the attic. There's something of an encounter with dead people, and the thought that we might see dead people resurrected, or we might see someone die, as we do in stories like The Crowd or The Wind. And finally, there's even hostility to technology, albeit in the form of the humble washing machine. It's not, as it turns out, a horror story, but it does capture the horrors of the life of 11-year-old orphan Mal. Now, when Ray put this story into his first book, Dark Carnival, 3 years after publication in Weird Tales, he made lots of very small edits. There are no major rewritings here, no major revisions, but lots of tiny word-level adjustments. For example, in one place he changes mum and dad, the phrase, to mother and father. Elsewhere he changes family pictures to pictures of the family. Ray was clearly something of a perfectionist in trying to get each sentence just right. He clearly never found any significant flaws in his plotting in this story, but he just felt the need to carefully polish his word choices. But then again, he never selected this story to appear in any of his later books. It didn't even make it into the October Country, which was his revision of Dark Carnival. Anyway, Reunion is not exactly a classic story. I'm not arguing that this is in the same league as The Crowd or The Wind, two stories I keep going on about because I think they're so damn good. But Reunion is very evocative, with truly excellent descriptive language, and it's very good at capturing the mood, the anger and the longing of Mal, and the shrewish harpy that is Aunt Opie. If it's not a story you remember, I highly recommend you go and take a look. Next is The Monster Maker, which Ray originally titled Pirates in Profile. And this one was first published in Planet Stories in spring 1944. And indeed, this is his first appearance in Planet Stories. It's one of the pulp magazines that Ray would contribute to again and again. You won't find The Monster Maker in any of Ray's books. He never collected it. He didn't put it in any of the retrospective collections. The only place you'll find it, apart from in an old issue of Planet Stories, is in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 1. Stand by for pulp. Click Hathaway is a photographer, a space photographer. He accompanies Space Patrolman Marnigan, whose nickname is Irish, on a mission to capture a space pirate called Gunther. Now Click and Marnigan find themselves struck by meteors and they crash land on an asteroid. Finding a gravity anomaly, they begin to theorize that this asteroid is really some kind of weapon or trap. It draws spaceships to it. It then flings meteors at them, and if the ship's crew survives, as Click and Irish have, then it unleashes a flock of alien beasts to attack them, trapping them in a cave. Click manages to get everything on film, and fortunately he has invented self-developing film. Oh yeah, people of today, we're used to photos being instant things that we generate with a click of a button on our camera or our phone. Back in 1944, you took a photo, it went onto a piece of film, which you had to have developed and then printed, and this took time. So Ray and the character of Click invent instant photos. He was there before Polaroid. Yes, Click has invented the Polaroid. Anyway, Click's instant developing film allows him to instantly present his photos to Irish so that they're able to study these photos and try and figure out what's been happening. But, much to their surprise, they discover that those alien beasties that have just pursued them can't be seen on film. What? Well, clearly those beasts must be psychological projections. They're not really there. This then gives Click a solution to their being trapped in a cave. They simply have to convince themselves that those aliens are an illusion, and then they can just walk out of the cave. Later on, they find the mind projector, the thing that's been transmitting these alien images, and Click stages 3 photos of Irish, which he puts into the mind projector thing, and they then use this to make Gunther the pirate and his men think that there is a whole army of Marnigans, a whole army of Irish. Yeah, it's all a bit nuts. But funnily enough, this story just about works, and it's not a million miles away from the type of story you might see nowadays on a Star Trek or a Doctor Who. It's pure pulp science fiction, yes, and it's not bad of that type. The technology, of course, is well out of date, so the story inevitably feels dated. And I'm sorry to say that Marnigan, Irish as he is known, is just about the most stereotypical Irishman you could imagine in a pulp story, with his red hair and his bright blue eyes and his humorous philosophical outlook in even the most deadly of situations. It's funny to think that later in his career, Ray would actually visit Ireland, get to know some Irish people, and write stories about them. He loved Irish characters. Many of the Irish characters he put in his stories were stereotypes. But Irish Marnigan in this story, I think, has the distinction of being Ray's first fictional Irish character. Next we have I, Rocket, which first appeared in Amazing Stories in May 1944. Amazing Stories is the magazine which is widely recognised as being the first science fiction magazine, first published in the 1920s under the editorship of Hugo Gernsback, and it's the magazine that gave us the term science fiction as we use it today. This was Ray's first ever appearance in Amazing Stories. He'd come back there from time to time, but this was the first. Now, I, Rocket, strangely, never appeared in any of Ray's collections, but it has been anthologised by other editors on occasion, and it was adapted for EC Comics in 1953, and you will find it in Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a Critical Edition, Volume 1. According to Ray Bradbury, The Life of Fiction, by John Eller and Bill Toupont, Ray had originally included I, Rocket in Long After Midnight, his 1976 story collection. But he had second thoughts about including it. In Collected Stories Volume 1, John Eller's textual notes tell us that Ray had attempted to revise the story for Long After Midnight, but he reached the conclusion that it needed a complete rewrite, and he wasn't interested in doing that at that point. So here's a very specific example of an early story written in 1943, published in 44, which could have appeared in a mid-70s Bradbury collection. And if it had, you can be sure that many readers would have assumed that it was written in the mid-70s. And, of course, some of those readers might then have been critical of the story for it being old-fashioned, which it would be because it would be 30 years old at that point. Now, in 2020, this story, this little-known Bradbury story, because, as I say, it's never been in any of his major books, this humble little story won the 1945 Retro Hugo, the award for Best Short Story published in 1944. As I've mentioned before on the podcast, Hugo Awards are given out annually by members of the World Science Fiction Convention, and Retro Hugos are occasionally given out for those years where normal Hugos weren't available. So, as the title suggests, they are retrospective Hugos. Whether science fiction readers in 1944 would have considered I, Rocket to be the best story of the year is debatable. But that's not the criterion for winning a Retro Hugo. It's all about what do readers of today think was the story from 1944 that was most deserving. And Ray's story was on the ballot alongside 2 stories by Clifford Simak and one each by Frederick Brown, Isaac Asimov and A.E. Van Vogt. So big names in science fiction. I, Rocket is one of Ray's best pulp science fiction stories. I'm not using pulp as a pejorative term here. Sometimes I do, but in this instance I'm referring to the fact that this was a story that appeared in a pulp science fiction magazine. The plot is really very simple. It's about a war rocket that goes off to fight Martians, but which is sabotaged by a couple of crewmen who are evidently working for the enemy. What makes the story special, though, is the way the story is told, because it's narrated by the rocket, hence the title I, Rocket. From the opening paragraph, we know how this story is going to be narrated. This is how it begins.
At the rate things are coming and going, it'll take a few hundred years to break me down into rust and corrosion. Maybe longer. In the meantime, I'll have many days and nights to think it all over. You can't stop atoms from revolving and humming their life orbits inside metal. That's how metal lives its own special life. That's how metal thinks.
Incidentally, I've used a female voice for that piece of text, because later on in the story it's implied that the rocket is female. And I think this really just comes from this tradition of calling ships she. So a rocket ship would be a she. We learn about the crew of the ship, mostly young spacefarers whose very first sight of deep space converts them instantly into religious believers, if they weren't already, and older crew members who are more used to the ways of space travel, such as Slop. Slop is the ship's cook, and probably his best claim to fame is that he has invented a special gravity bowl and gravity spoon to make it easier for you to consume soup in 0G. Thank you, Slop. We'll call you Slop from now on. And then there's Captain Lamb, who does his best to keep the rocket and the crew safe, despite their mission, which puts everybody's life in danger. After the war with Mars, the rocket becomes a cargo ship, and accidentally it ends its days in a crash landing. And that's really how the story had begun, with the rusting wreck of a ship just sitting there, pondering. But much to the ship's surprise, towards the end of the story, she's offered a rebirth as Captain Lamb locates the wreckage and decides he's going to put the rocket back into service, but this time to fight a different war. This one is a war with Venus. Yeah, this is all pulp science fiction and as tropey as you like, but I defy anyone not to feel for Lamb and the ship, especially when we learn that Lamb loves his ship. Next we have The Lake, which first appeared in Weird Tales in May 1944. You can find this in Dark Carnival. In the UK you can find it in the old collection called The Small Assassin. You can also find it in The Stories of Ray Bradbury, and it's in Collected Stories, a critical edition, Volume 1. It also was adapted for radio for the series Radio City Playhouse in 1949. It was adapted by Ray himself for Ray Bradbury Theatre in 1989. It was adapted for EC Comics in 1953. And it is one of Ray Bradbury's most reprinted stories. Ray always maintained that The Lake was the turning point in his writing career. He described The Lake as the first genuinely good story he ever wrote. And he's not wrong about it being good. The story is about a childhood incident where the narrator had witnessed the disappearance, the drowning, of a young girl called Tally. In telling the story, Ray could have just written it as it happened, but in fact, he sets the story 1 year later. So the young boy at the centre of the story, 12-year-old Harold, is revisiting the lake and the incident and reflecting on it. He recalls the actual drowning and he isolates himself from his mother as he goes to the spot where Tally disappeared, and he builds half a sandcastle. The idea being that if by some bizarre miracle Tally is still alive, she can come and build the other half. Because this, we learn, is a game they often played, building a sandcastle half each. As Harold walks away from the sandcastle, he turns back and he sees the waves lapping up against the shore and beginning to wash the sandcastle away. And the very next day, he leaves town with his mother because the family is moving west to live forever. Now there comes a leap forward of about a decade. We realise now that the narrator is actually a grown man recalling his childhood. He's now married and he's persuaded to travel back east for old time's sake and to show his wife where he grew up. And of course, he finds himself back on that beach. And of course, he deliberately isolates himself from his wife. And a lifeguard has found something in the lake, something that's been in the water for maybe 10 years. Of course, it's Tally. The narrator heads down the beach to where the lifeguard said he found the body, and to his astonishment, there is a freshly built half sandcastle. And there are footprints coming out of the water and going back into the water. The man returns to his wife, who he describes now as a strange person waiting for him. This is a very emotionally charged story. We feel the emotions of the boy, then of the man, getting effectively two perspectives on these sad events. Now, there are so many different ways that Ray could have written this story. He could easily have written this as a purely nostalgic piece, a sort of dandelion wine story, just through his descriptions of the coming of autumn at the lake the day before the boy heads east. That would have been a fine story in itself, if that's all it did. He could easily have included the death of Tally, but ended the story with the boy building the sandcastle and wishing for Tally's return. That would have been a fine story. But he seamlessly layers in the adult reflection on these childhood events, how these events haunt the narrator. He could have ended the story with the discovery of Tally's body, which brings closure of some kind. Ghastly closure, yes, but closure. But oh no, this is Ray Bradbury. He also seamlessly layers in that final sandcastle and the footprints coming out of the water and going away again. It's a Bradbury twist that turns an already weird tale even weirder. And just as with other of his weird tale stories, this one will haunt the reader every bit as much as the central character is haunted. Now, Ray claimed that he actually wrote this story in 1942, when he would have been 21 or 22 years old. There's no corroborating evidence for this, sadly. The original manuscript of The Lake is lost, and in fact the earliest version ever found is the version published in Weird Tales in 1944. If Ray was right when he said he wrote it in 1942, he must have held on to the story for well over a year before submitting it to Weird Tales. I like to think that he was so shocked and stunned by the quality of this story that he held it back while he busily churned out a few more of those pulp science fiction tales. I suspect, though, that he may have misremembered, that he maybe actually wrote the story in 43 and submitted it as soon as he was done with it. But in typical Bradbury fashion, he did revise the story a few times. First when he put it into Dark Carnival, his first book. Again when he reworked the Dark Carnival stories into The October Country. And of course again when he wrote the script for the TV version for Ray Bradbury Theatre. 3 opportunities to revisit the story, to polish it, to perfect it. The Dark Carnival revisions are slight, just the odd word choice here and there. That's all he changed. The most significant one for me is in the final sentence of the story. In the Weird Tales first version of this story, it ends, "I walked back up the beach to where a strange, awful person named Margaret was waiting for me, smiling." Now I like the shift that this line brings, indicating that the adult Harold's relationship with his wife is forever altered by the weird encounter with Tally, the girl he loved when he was 11 or 12. But describing her as strange, awful person is odd. Awful person suggests that Margaret has somehow done something wrong, which of course she hasn't. Margaret is a very innocent character who we hardly ever even meet in the story. Ray perhaps thought that that phrase was a step too far, because in the Dark Carnival version the sentence becomes, "I walked back up the beach to where a strange woman named Margaret was waiting for me, smiling." So strange, awful person becomes strange woman. Now this focuses our attention squarely on the word strange. And as readers, we understand that this sentence is all about Harold's perception. And it's not at all about any objective property that Margaret may have. So just that slight revision of that sentence changes the way the story hangs around after you've finished reading it. It forces you to reconsider the relationship between the man and his wife, but at the very last moment of the story. By the time we get to The October Country, which was published in 1955, that's 11 years on from this Weird Tales publication, we find further revisions. There's an astonishingly good revision to the opening paragraph of the story. The Weird Tales version is fine, but the October Country version is beautiful. This is how the story originally began in Weird Tales.
They cut the sky down to my size and threw it over the Michigan lake. Put some kids yelling on yellow sand with bouncing balls, a gull or two, a criticizing parent, and me, breaking out of a wet wave and finding this world bleary and moist.
That immediately gives us the sense of this being from the point of view of the child. It immediately places us on the beach, giving us a sense of the atmosphere there, and brings our narrator into focus as he emerges from the water. All very good setup. But now listen to this. This is how Ray renders the same scene in the October Country.
The wave shut me off from the world, from the birds in the sky, the children on the beach, my mother on the shore. There was a moment of green silence. Then the wave gave me back to the sky, the sand, the children yelling. I came out of the lake and the world was waiting for me, having hardly moved since I went away.
Wow. Just wow. That version puts us in the same place, but it gives the sensation of being caught by a wave, that sense of going under and being cut off, and then being returned to the world. But it also begins the story in the lake and marks the lake as some different space which is separate to the rest of the world. It cuts you off from the world. It totally foreshadows what we will learn about how Tally disappeared. And that final sentence, "The world was waiting for me, having hardly moved since I went away," that final sentence, in miniature, is what the whole story is about. It's about the boy who went away, and when he came back, in a sense, as a grown man, nothing had changed. When he came back, he was still drawn to Tally. He was still haunted by the lake. The lake was unchanged, partly because he returns in exactly the same season as when he was last here, but more importantly, Tally is unchanged. As the story tells us, the dead are unchanging. So that opening paragraph, it does everything that the original opening did, but it adds drama, suspense, foreshadowing, and a glimpse of the theme of the story. This isn't just great writing, this is great rewriting. On reflection, when Ray recalled this story as being his first good story, I think he was wrong. There were good stories before this, most definitely. But I think The Lake is probably the first story which draws together all of his strengths. Writing evocatively, writing nostalgically, writing about children, writing about people who are haunted by something, building mystery, building suspense, and then resolving mystery with a perspective-altering, weird twist. And on top of all of that craft, it feels like a personal story. This isn't a formula story written in imitation of anything anyone else ever wrote. Readers in 1944 would not have known whether there was any element of truth to the story. But from our vantage point, we have this additional benefit that we can see Ray's own life reflected in this story. The small town on the beaches of Lake Michigan, leaving town at the age of 12 to head for a new life in California. And there apparently really was a girl who disappeared into the lake when Ray was 11 or 12. So the lake brings together everything he was good at this point, and presents it in an affecting, personal style. What's astonishing to me is that this was published in a pulp magazine. Next we have Morgue Ship from Planet Stories, summer 1944. And you won't find this in any of Ray's collections, any of the retrospective collections. The only place you'll find it is in Collected Stories, a Critical Edition, Volume 1. Now, back in episode 58 of this podcast, I focused on a 1944 story called Lazarus Come Forth, which was set on a morgue ship. And I said in that episode that Ray used the setting of a morgue ship twice, in Lazarus Come Forth and in Morgue Ship. Well, here we are in early to mid 1944, and this is that other story, Morgue Ship. The concept is simple. We're in the middle of a space war, and with rocket ships being blown to pieces by the enemy, there will inevitably be casualties, and those casualties will be spacemen scattered into space who will not receive a decent burial. So the task of a morgue ship, and we're supposed to assume that there's a fleet of these things, is to gather up the dead and take them somewhere where they can be respectfully buried or cremated or whatever. The capacity of one ship, we're told in this story, is about 100 bodies. Yike. The story focuses on the crew. I don't know what to call them. Morticians, I guess. In this instance, we're in the company of Burnett, who is somewhat fed up with the job, which he's been doing now for 10 years, and his colleague Rice. And their routine of collecting dead bodies is broken when one of the corpses they pick up turns out to be the enemy's second in command. And that puts this morgue ship, sweeping up after a battle, smack in the centre of the conflict between Earth and Venus. And worse still, the corpse isn't a corpse. The alien Lethler that they've picked up is very much alive, having survived the vacuum of space with the aid of a transparent face mask. Adrift in a lifeboat, Lethler saw the passing morgue ship and blew his own lifeboat to bits, hoping that the morgue ship would pick him up. Yes, folks, this is space opera. Later in life, Ray would dismiss his morgue ship stories on two grounds. One, that he wrote them in imitation of Lee Brackett, his good friend, and he no longer believed that writers should do that sort of thing. And two, that the concept was flawed. Why on earth would you go out into space to rescue dead bodies? Well, to be fair to the younger Ray, maybe the concept seemed a bit more plausible in 1943 when he wrote the story in the midst of World War II, when families at home would be wondering and worrying very much about the bodies of their sons and brothers lost in battle and lost at sea. So I can sympathise with the young Ray writing this story. It's a clever concept. But I think the older Ray was correct. Morgue Ship is highly derivative, it's clunky, and it feels like it was written to order for Planet Stories magazine. So unfortunately, I can't recommend this one. I don't think it's worthy of your time in reading it. Its only real saving grace is that it has some of that Bradbury novelty of language and outlook. Other than that, I think I'd leave this story back in 1944. And then the last story for today is There Was an Old Woman, and this first appeared in Weird Tales in July 1944. You can find it in Dark Carnival, in The October Country, in The Stories of Ray Bradbury, and in Collected Stories, a Critical Edition, Volume 2. You will also find an adaptation that was done for Ray Bradbury Theatre, written by Ray himself. You'll find a radio version that was done for Bradbury 13 and as part of an October Country presentation for ABC Radio in 1984. And you'll find an EC Comics adaptation of it from 1953. This is a highly repeated Bradbury story. But it's not science fiction. It's not horror. If anything, it's dark comedy. This is the one about Aunt Tildy, the old woman who's got so much to do that she hasn't got time to die, thank you very much. One day, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she's visited by what's described as a dark young man who quietly, politely, tries to persuade her that she needs to get into that 6-foot-long wicker basket over there so that he and his colleagues can whisk her away. Well, she resists. He patiently waits and listens as she talks about her life and her beloved adopted daughter Emily. After a long period of her delaying tactics, her endless talking, Tildy realises that somehow it's still 3 o'clock. Time is standing still. Well, eventually the man somehow gets Tildy's body into the wicker, while a version of her, essentially a ghost at this point, continues to rant and rave. On hearing of Tildy's death, Emily comes home, and she is shocked to see Tildy's ghost. They head off in Emily's car to the mortuary, where Tildy is determined to get her body back. And she does. The mortuary folk eventually are so fed up of her obstructiveness that they give in to her and they let her merge back into her body. And at the story's end, she's back home, knitting her comforters once again, but very cautious of opening the door to any strangers. Now this one is a charming story, no question. It's funny, but it's also about something. It's about not giving in to death. And I imagine this as some kind of alternative to what we saw in The Crowd and in The Wind. You know, natural or supernatural forces come for somebody and they get taken out of this world. But in There Was an Old Woman, the Grim Reaper, a nice young man in a smart dark suit with an undertaker's van outside, comes for Tildy, but she's not ready, and she never will be. She squares off against death, and she wins. 16 years after this story was published, Ray published another story about an old woman facing death, Death and the Maiden. And it's almost the opposite of this one. I've always thought it amusing and amazing that Ray could return to a setting and completely flip the story, which is what he does with Death and the Maiden, which we'll talk about when we get to the relevant year. Well, 7 of Ray's stories from 1944. Only another 12 to go in this bumper year. I'll get to those in a future episode. For now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols, and theme music is by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. You can find the show notes and much more on Bradbury at bradburymedia.co.uk. And please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101, where we discuss the past, present and future of science fiction. You'll find it wherever good pods are given away.